It was a quiet morning in the small town of Oak Ridge. The kind of morning where the sun filtered lazily through the trees, casting long shadows on the pavement, and the birds chirped their songs to the rhythm of a sleepy town just beginning to stir. The streets were lined with modest homes, their lawns dotted with sprinklers that glistened in the sunlight. At the corner of Main Street, nestled between a coffee shop and a quaint bookstore, stood a small, unassuming diner. It had the same neon sign that had flickered in the window for years, the same checkered floors, the same comforting scent of freshly brewed coffee. This diner, with its cracked vinyl booths and laminated menus, was the kind of place that didn't draw much attention until today. Inside, amidst the low hum of conversation and clinking of silverware, a figure sat in the far corner booth, sipping slowly from a cup of coffee. His name was Marcus West, a man whose very presence seemed to defy the expectations that others often placed on him. As the CEO of West Tech Solutions, a multi-million-dollar tech company known for its innovations in cybersecurity, Marcus had achieved what many could only dream of. He had defied the odds in a field where people of color rarely reached the highest echelons. Yet, in this diner, as he sat in his neatly pressed shirt, casual yet professional, with a faint crease of weariness under his eyes, no one knew him. Not here, anyway. The waitress, a young woman in her early 20s, shuffled over to his table. She was polite, but clearly more focused on the task at hand than engaging with him beyond what was required. "Refill on the coffee, hon?" she asked, her voice cheerful but distracted. "Please," Marcus replied, offering a soft smile. His voice was calm, steady, just the right mix of kindness and authority that he had spent years honing. As she turned to fill his cup, he let his gaze drift to the window, his thoughts momentarily drifting away. The outside world, with its demands and expectations, felt far away here. Despite his success, Marcus was a man who had always been grounded. His mother had raised him in the heart of the city, teaching him the importance of humility, integrity, and respect. He had learned early on that wealth and power were fragile constructs, things that could be taken away in an instant if one lost sight of what truly mattered. His childhood was far from easy, but it shaped him into someone who understood the value of quiet strength. That strength had propelled him through law school, into the corporate world, and eventually to the top of his industry. But here, in this small diner, no one cared about his accolades or his high-ranking position in the tech world. In fact, no one knew him at all. It was just another reminder that in some places his wealth and power meant little. As he adjusted his tie, Marcus couldn't help but reflect on how the world had a funny way of treating people like him. A black man in an expensive suit, sitting in a small-town diner. People often saw what they wanted to see. They saw a man out of place, a stranger who didn't quite belong. He'd experienced it his whole life. Being underestimated, questioned, and often disregarded because of the color of his skin. A couple of booths down, a group of older men sat hunched over their breakfast plates. Their conversation was low, but loud enough for Marcus to overhear snippets. "Did you see the new car that guy drives?" one of them said, his voice tinged with judgment. "What's a guy like him doing in a place like this?" Marcus bit back a sigh. He had heard it all before, and in a town like Oak Ridge, where the population was overwhelmingly white, it wasn't unusual for him to be the subject of such murmurs. He had worked hard to rise above these petty biases, but they still stung, especially in moments like this when he found himself in the most ordinary of places, doing the most mundane of things. "Here you go," the waitress said, snapping him from his thoughts as she placed the fresh cup of coffee in front of him. Her eyes lingered on him for a second longer than necessary before she turned to walk away. It was in moments like this that Marcus truly felt the weight of his dual existence. As a CEO, he had a reputation to uphold. He gave speeches to packed auditoriums, sat in meetings with some of the most influential people in the country, and made decisions that impacted millions. But here, in this small-town diner, he was just another black man in an expensive car, someone who didn't quite fit the mold of the neighborhood. His accomplishments seemed to vanish in the face of deep-seated assumptions about who he was and where he belonged. The morning passed quietly, and Marcus took his time sipping the coffee, trying to savor the fleeting peace. He'd been in Oak Ridge for a conference the day before, and now he was about to head to a meeting with local government officials regarding a potential partnership for his company. The decision he was about to make could open doors to incredible opportunities, or it could turn out to be another waste of time. He was used to those stakes, but as the minutes ticked by, Marcus' peace was broken by the sound of a car pulling up outside. He looked up to see a police cruiser slowly pulling into the parking lot. His stomach tightened involuntarily. He had been in Oak Ridge for a day and a half, and while he had received nothing but polite service and cordial greetings, the lingering unease never quite went away. He was a stranger here. He was different. The police car parked in the space closest to the diner's entrance, and two officers stepped out, scanning the area as they made their way inside. One was a tall, broad-shouldered man with a sharp, authoritative air. The other was shorter, with a more relaxed posture, though his eyes still darted suspiciously over the patrons. Marcus didn't pay them much attention at first. He had learned long ago to ignore the occasional glance or raised eyebrow from those who saw him as an outsider. But when the taller officer's gaze shifted towards his table, a subtle change occurred. The officer paused, his eyes narrowing as if he had spotted something worth investigating. Marcus felt the familiar pang of anxiety, but he fought it back, keeping his expression neutral. This wasn't the first time this had happened. It wouldn't be the last. "Hey, Marcus, right?" The voice startled him. He looked up to see the officer standing at his table, a friendly smile on his face, but something about the officer's demeanor made it clear this wasn't just a casual greeting. He wasn't here because he recognized Marcus from the conference. He was here for something else. Marcus stood slowly, offering a cordial nod. "Yes, that's me," he said, maintaining his composure. His instincts told him to stay calm, but a growing unease crept up his spine. "We've had a report of a suspicious vehicle parked in the area," the officer continued. "Mind if we take a look at your ID?" Marcus' brow furrowed, a small flicker of disbelief passing over his face. He hadn't done anything wrong. He was just a man enjoying his breakfast in a quiet town. "I assure you, officer, I'm just here for breakfast," he said, keeping his voice level. The officer's smile didn't falter, but his eyes held a hint of skepticism. "I understand, sir. We just need to confirm a few details." Something in the officer's tone made it clear that this wasn't about routine. It wasn't about suspicion of a stolen vehicle or a random stop. It was about something deeper, something personal. Marcus nodded, his mind racing. He knew that maintaining composure was the key. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his ID, handing it over to the officer. His heart hammered in his chest as the officer took a long look at it. For a moment, there was silence. The officer handed back the ID, a slight shift in his expression. "You know," he said, his voice almost too casual, "we don't often see people like you around here." Marcus' jaw clenched, but he kept his composure. He had heard those words too many times to let them affect him now. Instead, he stood tall, his shoulders squared, his hands relaxed at his sides. "Is there anything else, officer?" he asked, the question hanging in the air like a challenge. The officer hesitated for a moment, his eyes scanning Marcus once more. Then, without another word, he turned and walked back to his partner, muttering something under his breath. The tension in the air seemed to dissipate, but Marcus knew better than to assume it was over. As he sat back down at his table, the weight of the moment settled on him. He wasn't just a man in an expensive suit anymore. He was a black man in a small-town diner, being watched, judged, and scrutinized in ways he couldn't escape. He knew the struggle he faced wasn't just about him. It was about everyone who had ever been looked at as an outsider, someone who didn't belong. The unease lingered, but Marcus shook it off. He had a meeting to attend, and despite everything, he wouldn't let this town, or anyone, define him. But one thing was clear: this was just the beginning. The fight ahead would require more than just success. It would require resilience, strength, and the unshakable resolve to stand up, no matter the odds. Marcus West sat quietly in the booth, staring into his coffee cup, the swirling brown liquid reflecting the quiet storm brewing inside him. He had learned long ago that the world would often see him first for his skin color, then for the rest of what he had worked tirelessly to build: a successful tech company, an empire of innovation, and a voice in national conversations about racial equity and technological advancement. He could feel the tension in the air as the officers lingered nearby, watching him, whispering among themselves. His gaze shifted to the door as a couple of regulars walked in, nodding a greeting to the officers. The diner's usual hum had returned, but Marcus could feel his heartbeat in his ears. The uneasy feeling he'd tried to push aside now took root in his chest. The officer's suspicion wasn't just a passing thought. It was growing into something more deliberate. The officer from earlier, Blake, returned to the table with a slight tilt to his posture. His approach had the same confidence that often came with authority, though Marcus noted the subtle hesitance in his partner's footsteps. Blake placed his hand on the edge of the table, leaning in a little too close for comfort. His fingers tapped lightly on the laminated surface, a rhythmic motion that carried an unspoken tension. "Just to confirm, Mr. West, you're aware that your vehicle isn't registered in your name?" Blake's voice was more formal now, carrying a sharp edge that hadn't been there before. It wasn't the usual questioning tone, it was a challenge. Marcus' eyes narrowed, but he kept his voice level. "I told you earlier, officer, I'm borrowing it from a colleague." He had explained this already, but the repetition felt like a trap he was meant to fall into. And yet, Blake continued, seemingly undeterred by Marcus' calm. "You didn't offer any explanation for why your name doesn't show up on the vehicle's registration or why you're driving through this neighborhood in such an expensive car." He leaned a little closer. "A lot of people don't expect to see a black man driving something like this." The comment lingered like smoke in the air, and for a moment, Marcus felt the familiar sting of indignation. But he resisted the urge to react. He had to remain calm, professional. His heart pounded in his chest, but outwardly, he simply nodded. "Like I said, I'm not here to make trouble," Marcus replied, keeping his voice smooth, his expression neutral. "I'm a businessman. This is a work car." Blake's eyes flicked to his partner, and for a brief second, Marcus saw doubt flicker in Hanson's gaze, but it disappeared almost as quickly as it appeared. The silent communication was clear. Blake wasn't going to let it go. "Not this time." "Well, Mr. West, since you're so insistent on complying, I think we'll take a look at your ID again," Blake said with an edge, as though Marcus' explanation wasn't enough. Marcus knew he had no choice but to comply, but the deeper frustration gnawed at him. He'd been through this many times before, whether in high-powered meetings where his contributions were constantly questioned or in quieter moments where he was expected to prove himself. This wasn't just a police stop. This was about the weight of history, the bias baked into the system, and the silent, insidious belief that no matter how far he went, no matter how much he achieved, he would always be just another black man in the wrong place. He handed over his identification again, more slowly this time, his fingers pressing the card into Blake's palm with deliberate care. Marcus could feel his pulse quicken, but he steadied his breath. The officer studied it briefly, the tension growing in the space between them. "Thank you," Blake said, his voice carrying an unmistakable note of sarcasm. "We'll just be a moment. Please, stay right there." Marcus remained seated, his back straight, but his mind was whirling. The injustice of it all felt suffocating. In Oak Ridge, where people drove used cars that matched the neighborhood's modest style, his sleek, black SUV was a red flag. The assumptions had come so easily, so naturally, based solely on the color of his skin. When Blake returned a few minutes later, his eyes were darker, more intense. "Mr. West, we're going to need to take a deeper look at your car. You said you were on official business? Maybe you can explain what's inside." His voice was hard, no longer questioning, but commanding, as though Marcus had already been found guilty in his eyes. Marcus took a deep breath, still refusing to let his emotions show. He didn't want to escalate things, but the indignity of being treated like a criminal in front of everyone, it was too much. "I've already told you," Marcus said, his voice low, but now tinged with frustration. "I'm on business, just a regular trip. There's nothing suspicious about my car or my work." But Blake was already moving toward the SUV, his partner trailing behind, a ghost of hesitation in his eyes. "Let's take a look. You don't mind, do you, Mr. West?" Marcus stood up, his movements slow and deliberate. "I mind," he said firmly, the weight of the moment settling into his chest. "But I'm not resisting." He was well aware of how quickly things could spiral out of control, how a simple disagreement could turn into something far worse. His training, years of handling high-stakes negotiations, delicate political moments, had taught him the power of control. And right now, control meant being calm in the face of an injustice that no one seemed ready to address. He followed Blake to the SUV, his steps measured but his heart racing. As Blake opened the door, Marcus watched him flick his gaze inside. The officer's hands hovered over a few papers on the front seat, ignoring the carefully organized briefcase Marcus had placed beside it, filled with non-sensitive documents. "Let's see," Blake muttered under his breath, clearly still digging for an excuse to escalate things. When his fingers landed on an envelope with Marcus Company's logo, just a business document, Blake's eyes brightened, a small glint of something dangerous in his expression. "Got something here," Blake said, lifting the envelope. "What's this?" "It looks official." Marcus clenched his jaw but kept his voice steady. "It's business correspondence," he said. "For a meeting later. Do you want me to open it for you?" Blake shook his head and snatched the papers from his hands. "No need. I'll be the judge of that." He didn't even glance at it before placing it back on the seat. Marcus bit back a retort, focusing all his energy on maintaining composure. His thoughts spun in a vortex of frustration, anger, and the all-too-familiar weight of being perceived as a threat based on nothing more than his skin color. The officer's treatment wasn't just about this moment. It was about years of assumptions that had been perpetuated across society. Marcus had fought for everything he had, clawing his way to the top. And yet, here he was stripped of his achievements and reduced to something less by a simple look. As Blake stood up, satisfied that he hadn't uncovered anything that could justify his suspicions, Marcus could see the officer's deflection taking shape. The racial bias that had fueled this entire interaction wouldn't disappear just because there was nothing to find. "All right," Blake muttered, his voice still dismissive. "We'll let you go, but you need to be more careful next time. Not everyone in this town is as understanding." "Understanding of what?" Marcus asked, his voice now tinged with disbelief. Blake didn't answer, instead waving dismissively as he turned away. His partner, Hanson, still stood a few steps behind, looking uncomfortable but unwilling to say anything. Marcus glanced around the diner, meeting the eyes of the few patrons who had been watching the exchange. No one said a word. The silence, the unspoken judgment. It stung more than anything Blake had said. "Have a nice day," Blake called over his shoulder, his words more in order than a suggestion. "You might want to take the scenic route out of here, Mr. West, just to avoid any misunderstandings." Marcus didn't respond. Instead, he turned and walked back to his car, trying to suppress the flood of emotions threatening to burst forth. He wasn't sure whether to feel relief or anger, but he certainly felt the sting of humiliation, something he hadn't experienced in years. As he drove away, the weight of the encounter stayed with him, the injustice like a shadow in the rearview mirror. He knew this wouldn't be the last time he'd face this kind of treatment. Not in Oak Ridge, not in a world that still saw him as less than what he was. But one thing was clear, this wasn't just about a random stop. It was a symptom of something deeper, something that Marcus couldn't ignore any longer. Marcus West had been down this road before. His success always seemed to spark suspicion in some. He'd grown accustomed to being treated differently because of his skin color. Yet today, as he drove home from the diner, the sting of the encounter still burned. The officers had treated him with a dismissive arrogance that felt heavier than any personal insult. They didn't even care about his credentials or his identity. They simply saw a black man in a luxury vehicle, and that was enough to assume the worst. As he entered his neighborhood, the weight of the morning's events sat heavily on him. The affluent neighborhood of Ashfield had always been a place where people kept their heads down, either because they were too busy with their own lives or because they didn't want to be drawn into anything remotely controversial. But now, for the first time, Marcus realized how much he'd been living in a bubble that had protected him from the brutal reality that many black men and women faced every day. He parked his car in the driveway, the same driveway where he had spent countless hours celebrating promotions, anniversaries, and other milestones. But today, it felt more like a cage than a sanctuary. Marcus sat in his car for a long moment, collecting his thoughts. His phone buzzed in his pocket. Mitchell. "Hey, Marcus. I just got off the phone with a contact at the precinct," Mitchell said, his voice tense. "There's been some chatter about what happened at the diner. The officers, Blake especially, are pushing a story that's starting to get some traction. They're talking about suspicious activity and potential criminal involvement." Marcus leaned forward in his seat, the weight of Mitchell's words settling like lead in his chest. "What exactly are they saying?" he asked, his voice quieter now, the calm veneer slipping away. "They're spinning it, man. They're saying you were evasive, that you were driving an unregistered car, basically painting you as a threat. They're saying you had a questionable device in the car, something techie they didn't understand. You know the drill, guilty until proven innocent." Marcus' blood ran cold. "They're lying." "I know," Mitchell said quickly. "But this is big. It's not just a routine stop anymore. It's about to get ugly." Marcus' pulse quickened. He had been stopped by officers before, but this felt different. His mind raced through the implications. He could sit back and hope that the truth would somehow come out on its own, or he could take action. But if he did nothing, the narrative would be written for him, and he could kiss everything he'd worked for goodbye. "How soon until they move on this?" Marcus asked, his voice now firm. "Within hours," Mitchell said. "The precinct's already working with internal affairs. They're framing you as the aggressor, hoping to bury it before anyone looks too closely." Marcus' knuckles tightened on the steering wheel. The room around him felt stifling, and he suddenly found himself standing outside his car, walking toward the front door as if on autopilot. His mind raced, and his hands were steady despite the storm of thoughts swirling inside. He couldn't let this slide. He couldn't let Blake's reckless prejudice define him. "I need to act, Mitchell," he said, his tone resolute. "If they're going to write a story about me, I'll write my own." By the time Marcus made it into the house, he had already drafted a plan in his head. It wasn't just about clearing his name. It was about exposing the system that allowed this kind of bias to fester in the first place. He sat at the kitchen table, phone in hand, as his mind sifted through the details of what he could do. The news would spread quickly, so he needed to make sure that his version of events would be heard before the police could spin their story further. As he scrolled through his contacts, his mind settled on one name, Agent Kira Mitchell, a trusted ally from his past dealings with tech security. She had connections within the media and law enforcement and could help him navigate the situation before it spiraled out of control. He made the call. "Kira, I need your help," Marcus said when she picked up. "You've got my attention." "What happened?" she asked, sensing the urgency in his voice. Marcus recounted the events of the morning. The traffic stop, the unprovoked aggression from Blake, the way his identity had been dismissed without question. Kira listened in silence before responding. "That's unacceptable. It's beyond time we start talking about systemic racism within the system. You got a platform. We can push back on this," she said, her voice calm but fierce. "I need to go public. I need to make sure the story doesn't get twisted before it's too late. Can you help me gather the right people?" Marcus asked, the weight of the decision settling in his chest. "Absolutely. I'll contact some trusted reporters, and we'll start preparing a statement." "But Marcus, we're talking about taking this public. It'll come with backlash. You sure you're ready for that?" Marcus stood by the window, looking out at the quiet neighborhood. He could almost hear the murmurs, the whispers of what might happen. But he knew what he had to do. The truth needed to be out there, and he would be the one to make sure it happened. "I've been fighting against this my whole life, Kira," he said, his voice steady now. "It's time to make a stand." That night, Marcus couldn't sleep. His mind raced with thoughts of his childhood, the subtle and not-so-subtle racism that had shaped his experiences. He thought of his parents, of how they'd taught him to be better, to rise above the prejudice that would inevitably come his way. He thought of the young black men and women who didn't have the luxury of speaking out, of challenging the system. This wasn't just about him anymore. This was about everyone who had been wronged by people who wore their badges like shields, untouchable and unaccountable. He checked his phone again. Kira had confirmed that the media team was ready to go public. The story was already starting to leak online, the headlines framing the events of the morning in a twisted light. They were already calling him the suspect in a potential cybercrime investigation, his reputation being dragged through the mud by the hour. He couldn't wait any longer. Marcus walked to his home office, powered on his computer, and began writing a statement. It wasn't going to be just another press release. It would be his declaration, his challenge to the lies being spread about him. He would stand tall, not just for himself, but for the countless others who had been pushed aside or painted as criminals simply because of their race. He typed the words, his fingers steady despite the growing storm inside him. I'm not just a businessman. I'm a black man, a man who has fought for every inch of progress I've made. Today, I'm speaking out against the systemic racism that pervades our justice system, against the officers who saw me as a threat before they even knew my name. I've been wrongfully detained, targeted because of my skin color, and today I will not remain silent. This is not just about me. It is about all the men and women whose stories have been ignored or twisted by the system that is supposed to protect them. Marcus hit send, his heart pounding. It was out there now, his truth, his fight. And it was only the beginning. The next morning, as Marcus prepared to face the fallout, he received another message, this time from Mitchell. It's getting bigger. The press is eating it up, but so is the backlash. Blake's department is digging in, saying it was a mistake. But they can't cover this up, Marcus. This is the moment. Marcus took a deep breath, his resolve hardening. It wasn't just a mistake anymore. It was the beginning of a war, one he was ready to fight. The stakes were higher than ever. His life, his career, everything he had worked for was on the line. But the real question was, would the truth be enough to tear down the walls built on systemic racism and bias? Or would the powerful forces against him find a way to silence him, to make his struggles seem like just another headline? As Marcus prepared for the next stage, he knew this was just the start of a much larger battle, and he was more determined than ever to see it through. The world was watching now, and he wasn't about to let this fight be for nothing. End with the cliffhanger. Would the truth be enough? Could Marcus hold his ground, or would the system fight back harder than he anticipated? His journey was far from over, and everything he'd worked for hung in the balance. Marcus stood by his window, looking out at the sprawling skyline, his thoughts a whirl of uncertainty. The media had exploded with coverage of the false accusations against him, and while public opinion was divided, the mounting pressure was undeniable. The story had quickly escalated from a simple misunderstanding to a full-blown scandal. Blake's department was pushing their narrative hard, accusing him of criminal activity, of defying officers' orders, and even of resisting arrest. They were trying to paint him as an aggressor in the face of law enforcement's good intentions. But Marcus knew the truth, and the truth would soon come out. It had been hours since he sent out his statement, and the overwhelming response had been both empowering and terrifying. On one hand, he had the truth on his side, and he had sparked a national conversation about racial profiling. But on the other, the backlash was fierce. The forces aligned against him, corrupt officers, a system that protected its own, would not go down quietly. He could already feel the stakes rising higher. This was no longer about his reputation. It was about a corrupt system that had persisted far too long. A knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. It was Mitchell, looking more serious than usual, his eyes wide with concern. He stepped inside, closing the door behind him. "Marcus, you need to be prepared," Mitchell said, his voice low. "They've gone public with a response. The department is denying everything, saying you were resisting arrest and that you provoked them." Marcus exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. "Of course they are. They won't admit to anything. They never do." Mitchell nodded. "The worst part? They've got a witness. A couple of officers who say they saw you acting aggressively, yelling at Blake. They're painting you as the one who escalated the situation." Marcus felt his chest tighten, a sense of helplessness creeping in. "So they're doing everything they can to turn the tables. They're going to make it look like I'm the one in the wrong." "Exactly. And this isn't just about Blake anymore," Mitchell continued, his voice tense. "Internal Affairs is involved now. They're making it look like it was a justified stop, and they're working fast to cover their tracks." The weight of those words hit Marcus like a physical blow. Internal Affairs, the very department tasked with overseeing law enforcement, was now backing up Blake's fabricated story. Marcus had thought he could trust the system, but now the system was betraying him, complicit in a cover-up that would destroy everything he had worked for. I can't let this go, Mitchell, Marcus said, his voice steady, but his anger simmering just below the surface. I've spent my whole life fighting for what's right. I'm not going to let these people destroy me just because of their biases. Mitchell looked at him, his expression conflicted. I know you're angry, Marcus. You have every right to be. But we need to be careful here. The department is pulling strings everywhere. They've got the media on their side, and the public is already starting to turn against you. They're going to push back hard, and they'll do anything to make sure you don't win this. Marcus paced the room, his mind working in overdrive. He needed to take action, but it had to be calculated. He couldn't afford to get emotional. He had to be smart. His career, his reputation, and the future of countless others who had suffered at the hands of a biased system were on the line. I need to get ahead of this, Mitchell, Marcus said, his tone sharp now. I'm going to expose them. I'm going to show the world how deep this corruption runs. They've already made their move. They think they've won. But I'll make sure the truth comes out before they can bury it. Mitchell hesitated for a moment, and then nodded. I'll help you. We need to go public with everything we have, every piece of evidence, every statement, every recording. The longer we wait, the more they'll control the narrative. I'm done being quiet, Marcus replied, his voice a quiet fury. I've spent my life complying, trying to play by their rules. But now it's time to fight back. I'll make sure they know who they're dealing with. As Marcus reached for his phone, his thoughts were interrupted by another text from Kira. It was a simple message, but the implications were profound. They're pushing for an arrest. Be ready. His heart skipped a beat. Arrest. The stakes had just been raised to a level he hadn't anticipated. He knew they were going to pull every string to discredit him, but now it seemed they were willing to go even further. They weren't just trying to smear his name. They were preparing to lock him up. Mitchell, get Kira on the phone. Now, Marcus said urgently, his fingers already moving across his phone screen. A few moments later, Kira's voice came through, calm but filled with urgency. Marcus, they're moving fast. They've got a warrant for your arrest. They're saying you violated federal law by resisting arrest and obstructing justice. Blake's already gotten the paperwork started. Marcus' breath caught in his throat. A warrant. His mind raced. This wasn't just about false accusations anymore. They were officially trying to take him down, to remove him from the equation altogether. I won't let them, Marcus muttered, his voice cold with resolve. They can't do this to me. I know my rights, and I'm not going down without a fight. Get ready, Marcus. This is going to be a battle, but we'll get through it together. You have to stand strong. Marcus took a deep breath, feeling the weight of what was about to come. He had always known that pushing back against the system would come with consequences, but now it was personal. He wasn't just fighting for himself. He was fighting for everyone who had been swept under the rug, ignored, or silenced by the very institutions meant to protect them. The next few hours were a blur of phone calls, strategizing, and preparing for the inevitable. Mitchell had pulled in several allies from different departments, and Kira was already working with her media contacts to ensure that the story was framed the right way. Marcus couldn't sit still. Every time he thought about Blake's smug expression, about the officers who had so casually dismissed his identity, he could feel the rage building up inside him. He wasn't going to let them win. He couldn't. Not after everything they had done. By the time he was dressed and ready to go, the streets outside his house were filled with reporters, their cameras pointed at the front door like hungry vultures. The pressure was mounting, and he knew that once he stepped out into the public eye, there would be no turning back. Mitchell, make sure we've got everything lined up, Marcus said, his voice steady but filled with urgency. Once we go public, there's no taking it back. This has to be done right. I've got it covered, Mitchell replied, his voice filled with determination. You just need to focus on speaking your truth. We'll take care of the rest. Marcus nodded, taking one last look around his home. This wasn't just about him anymore. This was bigger than any one person. He was fighting for a system that needed to be overhauled, for a society that had been conditioned to view people like him as a threat, no matter what they had accomplished. He walked out the door, his steps firm and resolute, ready to face the storm that was coming. The next few moments were crucial. The media were already surrounding him, microphones thrust in his face, questions flying like daggers. The moment had arrived. Mr. West, can you comment on the charges being leveled against you? A reporter asked. Marcus took a deep breath, pushing past the noise of the world around him. "The truth is simple," he said, his voice clear and unwavering. "I was wrongfully detained, and I'm not going to let that be swept under the rug. I'm not here to play the victim. I'm here to show everyone the truth of what's been happening. I've been targeted because of the color of my skin, because of the assumptions that were made about me the moment they saw my face. And I will not remain silent." As Marcus spoke, he could feel the weight of everything on his shoulders. This wasn't just about clearing his name. This was about taking a stand against the system that had failed him and so many others. But even as the media swarmed him, even as the cameras clicked and flashed, Marcus knew that this was only the beginning. They would push back. They would try to silence him. But he wasn't backing down. Not now, not ever. Marcus stood outside the courthouse, the bright midday sun casting long shadows over the steps in front of him. The air was thick with anticipation, a mix of reporters shouting questions and the buzz of activity around the building. He had prepared for this moment, for the showdown that was now unfolding. But there was no preparing for the weight of the situation, no preparing for the raw anger and injustice he had felt over the past few weeks to come crashing down all at once. He was here to make a stand, not just for himself, but for everyone who had suffered the same treatment, the same humiliation, the same bias. Today, he was not just Marcus West, the businessman, the successful CEO. Today, he was the voice of accountability. As he made his way through the crowd, Marcus could feel the eyes on him. Some were sympathetic, others skeptical. His mind was racing as he rehearsed his statement in his head. This was his moment. There was no going back now. The door to the courtroom swung open, and Marcus stepped inside, followed closely by his attorney. The courtroom was filled with people, lawyers, reporters, officers, each one waiting for the next chapter of the case to unfold. But it was the two figures standing at the front that caught Marcus's attention. Officer Blake and his superior, Captain Daniels. Marcus could feel his pulse quicken as he made his way toward the center of the room. This was it, the moment he had been waiting for. "Mr. West," the judge called, signaling him to take the stand. Marcus nodded and approached the witness stand, his mind set, his resolve unwavering. The courtroom fell silent, all eyes on him. He took a deep breath, straightened his posture, and began. "The events that led to my detainment were based on assumptions, biases, and a clear abuse of power," he said, his voice calm but firm. "Officer Blake, despite my clear identification and credentials as a Secret Service agent, chose to disregard all that in favor of a narrative that painted me as a criminal. His actions were not just illegal, they were born of prejudice." There was a murmur in the courtroom. Marcus's words hung in the air, but it was only the beginning. He could feel the tension, the energy building. Officer Blake's face was set in a mask of defiance, but his eyes flickered with unease. Captain Daniels, standing beside him, glanced at Marcus, but his expression was unreadable. "You are making serious accusations, Mr. West," the prosecutor said, standing up from his seat. "Accusations that, if proven wrong, could ruin the reputations of officers who've dedicated their lives to protecting this community." Marcus met the prosecutor's gaze, his jaw tightening. "I'm not accusing anyone of anything they didn't already show themselves to be, sir," he said. "I've seen the evidence. I've heard the testimonies. The only person whose reputation is at risk here is Officer Blake's, and his is built on lies." The prosecutor smirked. "And you expect us to take your word for it? You, a man who was detained and arrested under suspicion of being involved in a criminal activity." "It's not about what I expect," Marcus replied coolly. "It's about what's been proven. I was detained unlawfully, without cause. Officer Blake acted on nothing but his own assumptions. And the system that allowed him to do so? That's what we need to address here." Blake shifted uncomfortably in his seat, and Marcus noticed Captain Daniels, who had been silent until now, straighten up as though to regain control of the room. "This is not the place for your accusations, Mr. West," Captain Daniels interjected, his voice low but filled with authority. "We're here to discuss facts, not dramatize things." Marcus's gaze locked with Daniels, his gaze steady. He had faced down difficult situations before, but this moment felt different. It wasn't just about defending himself. It was about dismantling the system that allowed this type of behavior to continue. "The fact is, Captain," Marcus began, his voice cutting through the tension, "that this system is broken. Blake's actions were not an isolated incident. They are a direct result of a culture of bias and unchecked power. I may be standing here today because of my position, but there are countless others who don't have the privilege of being heard. I am here to make sure that changes." The room was dead silent. Blake's face flushed, and he glanced at Daniels, who finally looked uncomfortable. This was the turning point. Marcus could feel the weight of the room shift, the eyes of the audience now locked on him. Captain Daniels stood up, his face tight with frustration. "You think you're the first person to complain about police misconduct?" he asked, his voice rising. "We deal with this day in and day out. You think this is about race? You think your incident is unique? I've dealt with worse, seen worse. And I'll tell you right now, you're not the hero here." The words stung, but Marcus was ready. He had been waiting for this moment. He was done with the silence, done with the fear that had held him back for so long. "Maybe you're right, Captain," Marcus said, his voice low and dangerous. "But this isn't about being a hero. This is about accountability. And what you just said tells me everything I need to know about the system you protect. It's not about justice. It's about preserving a status quo that harms people like me, people like them." He gestured toward the gallery where people sat, most of them people of color, watching silently. People who have never had the chance to tell their side of the story. "Well, I'm telling mine, and I won't stop until the truth comes out." The tension in the room thickened. For a moment, Captain Daniels said nothing. He seemed to be wrestling with something, whether it was pride, anger, or something deeper. Marcus couldn't tell. But he knew that whatever it was, it had been exposed. The mask had slipped, and the truth about the system was finally out in the open. Blake, who had remained quiet, suddenly stood up, his voice tight with rage. "You think you know what it's like to protect this city?" he spat. "You think you know what it's like to put your life on the line every day? Don't you dare lecture me about justice." Marcus's eyes narrowed. "No, Blake," he said evenly, "but I know what it's like to be judged before you even open your mouth. I know what it's like to be treated like a criminal because of the color of your skin. And I know what it's like to be dismissed by people who should be upholding the law." Blake's hands balled into fists at his sides, and Marcus could see the veins in his neck bulging as he struggled to maintain control. But it was too late. The words had been said. The truth had been revealed. There was no turning back. Captain Daniels looked at Blake, his face flushed with embarrassment and anger. "Sit down, Blake," he muttered, his voice sharp. "You're done here." Blake opened his mouth to protest, but Daniels silenced him with a cold glare. Blake's shoulders slumped, and he reluctantly sat down. Marcus felt the smallest victory, but it was only the beginning. He had exposed their corruption, but now he needed to see it through. The judge cleared his throat, standing up and signaling the end of the confrontation. "We will adjourn for the day," he said, his voice calm but firm. "We'll reconvene tomorrow. Mr. West, your statements will be reviewed. The court will look into the details of this case further." Marcus nodded, but he could feel the weight of the next few days pressing down on him. This battle wasn't over. It had only just begun. As he left the courthouse, he could feel the eyes of the reporters on him. The spotlight was on him now. He had made his stand. But the real fight was only just beginning. The system had been exposed, but whether it would change remained uncertain. And as Marcus walked to his car, he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't done. Not by a long shot. Marcus had waited weeks for this moment. The day had finally arrived. Today, he would stand face to face with the officers who had wronged him, with the system that had failed him. And he would make sure the world saw what had been done. The courtroom was packed. The energy was palpable. Reporters lined the back, taking notes, eyes trained on the defendants, Officer Blake and Captain Daniels. Marcus could see them sitting in the front row, their faces tense, eyes avoiding his. He could feel their fear, and it filled him with resolve. They had no idea what was coming. The judge, an older man with a stern face, glanced up at Marcus, giving him a silent nod of approval. It was his turn, the moment he'd been waiting for. The moment he would expose the truth. With steady steps, Marcus made his way to the witness stand, his heart pounding in his chest. His mind was clear. The path ahead was uncertain, but he was ready to speak his truth. ready to make sure the world saw the corruption in front of them. He sat down on the stand, adjusted the microphone, and looked directly at Officer Blake, who was sitting stone-faced next to Captain Daniels. He had studied their every move, every interaction. But now, it was his time. "Mr. West," the judge called, his voice booming through the courtroom. "You may begin." Marcus nodded, his voice calm but unwavering. "The events that led to my detainment were based on nothing but assumptions, prejudice, and a system that refused to see me for who I truly am. Officer Blake, standing before me, is guilty of everything I'm about to say." A murmur ran through the room. Blake's eyes narrowed, but Marcus continued unfazed. "I was stopped on the basis of an assumption. An officer saw a black man driving an expensive car in a predominantly white neighborhood, and immediately I was the suspect. My rights were violated, my identity disregarded, and I was detained for hours without cause. And through it all, Officer Blake's prejudices led him to make decisions that put me in a cell without so much as a second thought. And now, here we are, the truth coming to light." Blake shifted in his seat, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. Captain Daniels, his superior, sat still, but his eyes flickered with discomfort. Marcus could see that the walls were beginning to crumble. But he wouldn't stop now. "I've been forced to relive this moment, day after day. I've seen firsthand how this system fails people like me. I'm not here because of a single officer's mistake. No, I'm here because the system that trained him, that allowed him to treat me like I wasn't human, is just as guilty. And it's not just about me, not anymore. This is about all the people who have been unjustly targeted, misjudged, and hurt by those in positions of power." There was a pause. The room was silent. But Marcus could feel the weight of his words settling over everyone in the room. He knew this wasn't just a battle for him. It was a battle for everyone who had ever been wronged. The prosecutor stood up, his voice icy. "Mr. West, these are serious accusations you're making. You claim that Officer Blake acted on prejudice. How do you expect us to believe that? A career officer who's been trained and evaluated just makes assumptions based on race?" Marcus locked eyes with the prosecutor. "Because that's exactly what happened. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't a hunch gone wrong. Officer Blake decided who I was before I even opened my mouth. And now, we see the reality of that decision." At the back of the courtroom, reporters shuffled, eager to capture every word. The tension was high, and it only escalated with each passing second. But Marcus was unfazed. He knew what had to be done. Blake was on the edge of his seat, his hands clenched into fists. "This is a lie," he finally muttered under his breath. Marcus didn't flinch. He had expected this. He had known that Blake would resist the truth, would try to twist the narrative to protect himself. But he wouldn't let that happen. The judge looked at Blake, his voice stern. "Officer Blake, if you cannot contain your emotions, you will be removed from the courtroom." Blake glared at Marcus, his gaze full of contempt. "This is just a game to you, isn't it? You think you could just sit there and slander my name? That's rich." Marcus leaned forward slightly. "I'm not playing a game, Blake. You are, and it's a dangerous one. The game you've been playing, the one that has been used to destroy so many lives before mine, is the one that ends today." Blake's jaw tightened, but before he could respond, Captain Daniels stood up, his voice booming with authority. "Enough! This courtroom is not a place for personal attacks. Mr. West, if you cannot stick to the facts, I will have you removed." Marcus locked eyes with Daniels, his resolve hardening. This wasn't just about an officer who had overstepped his bounds. This was about a system that allowed those with power to silence the truth. And Marcus was no longer afraid to speak it. "I'll tell you what I know," Marcus said, his voice calm but full of conviction. "I know that Officer Blake used his badge to justify his bias, to strip me of my dignity. I know that he assumed that because I was a black man in an expensive car, I was up to no good. And I know that he doesn't care about the truth. He only cares about holding on to his own power." The silence in the room was deafening. For a moment, no one spoke. Then it happened. Blake's carefully controlled mask slipped. His true intentions were exposed. "You think you're better than me, don't you?" Blake's voice shook, his anger boiling over. "You think because you got a fancy title, because you have some job that gives you power, that you can just walk around like you're above it all? This is what happens when people like you think you can get away with anything. Marcus's heart pounded, but he didn't back down. This was the moment. The moment when Blake's prejudice was revealed, and the real nature of the conflict was laid bare for everyone to see. "No, Blake," Marcus said, his voice steady. "This is what happens when people like you believe that your authority makes you untouchable. But the truth is you're not untouchable. And I'm not the one who's been playing a game. You have been. And now it's over." Blake opened his mouth to retort, but Marcus held up a hand, silencing him. "You made your choice. And now you'll face the consequences," Marcus said. The room was alive with tension. The audience was on the edge of their seats, eyes darting between the two men. But Marcus's gaze never wavered from Blake. Then the door opened, and a figure stepped into the courtroom. It was Mitchell, one of Marcus's allies, a lawyer who had been working behind the scenes to ensure that the evidence of Blake's corruption was presented. Mitchell made his way to the front of the room, carrying a folder with damning documents. He handed them to the judge without saying a word. The judge took the folder and opened it, scanning through the contents. The room waited in silence, every eye on the judge as he read. Finally, the judge looked up, his face grave. "It seems," he said, his voice heavy, "that the allegations Mr. West has made are not only valid, but have been corroborated by multiple sources. Officer Blake, Captain Daniels, I suggest you prepare for the consequences of your actions." Blake's face went pale. Captain Daniels shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The weight of the situation was finally hitting them both. But just as Marcus thought the victory was his, Captain Daniels stood up, his voice low and dangerous. "This isn't over, Mr. West," he said. "You think this is the end? You've only just begun to see the power that I wield." Marcus's heart sank, but he didn't show it. The battle was far from over. The truth had come to light, but the fight for justice was just beginning. As the room erupted into chaos, Marcus knew that this was only one chapter in a much larger story. The stakes had just been raised, and he was prepared for whatever came next. The tension in the courtroom was suffocating as the judge read through the files handed to him. Marcus felt the weight of the moment, the long road that had led him here, the emotional toll of standing up against the very system that was supposed to protect him. His eyes never left Officer Blake, whose usual bravado had evaporated into a look of uncertainty. It was clear that the man who once wielded his power with such disdain was now facing the consequences of his actions. Based on the overwhelming evidence, the judge's voice broke the silence. "Officer Blake, you have violated your duty and the public trust. The abuse of power demonstrated in this case is unacceptable. I am ordering an immediate suspension pending a full investigation by Internal Affairs." The words hit like a hammer, and for a moment, Marcus allowed himself to breathe. Officer Blake's face had turned an ashen shade. He opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out. There was no defense left. The truth had been laid bare. "And Captain Daniels," the judge continued, glancing at the older officer, "while you were not directly involved in the detainment of Mr. West, your failure to intervene and your attempt to cover up the actions of Officer Blake will also be under investigation. The systemic issues within your department will be addressed." The room stirred as murmurs ran through the crowd. Marcus held his ground, his heart racing. He had won this battle, but the fight for justice was far from over. He knew that while Blake and Daniels would face consequences, the systemic issues that allowed this type of injustice to happen were much larger. The prosecutors stood up and addressed the court. "In light of the evidence presented, we will be filing charges against Officer Blake for unlawful detainment, evidence tampering, and racial profiling. We will also be pressing charges against Captain Daniels for dereliction of duty and obstruction of justice." Marcus nodded as he glanced at the lawyers and officers around him. The wheels were turning now, but the larger fight, the one he had been waging for years, was just beginning to take shape. As Blake was escorted out of the courtroom, his face a mixture of disbelief and shame, Marcus felt a flicker of satisfaction. But it wasn't enough. Not yet. He turned to Mitchell, who had been standing by his side throughout the entire ordeal. Mitchell was the one who had uncovered crucial evidence, the one who had kept the pressure on the department to ensure the truth came out. Their partnership had been invaluable, and as the dust began to settle, Mitchell gave Marcus a slight nod. "You did it, man," Mitchell said quietly, a genuine smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "You forced them to reckon with their lies." Marcus felt a weight lift off his shoulders. "It's not just about me, Mitchell. It's about everyone who's been mistreated, who's faced the same kind of bias. This was only one part of a much bigger issue." Mitchell's smile faded slightly as he glanced around the courtroom, sensing the larger scope of the battle ahead. "Yeah, but today you took a stand, and that's huge." Marcus turned his gaze back to the judge, who was now preparing to adjourn the session. He couldn't help but think of the countless others who had never had the chance to speak out, whose voices had been silenced before they could even start. Today, he had taken one step toward making sure that no one else would have to suffer the same fate. As the courtroom slowly emptied, Marcus found himself walking alongside his attorneys and a few trusted allies, each step heavy with the realization that his life had just changed forever. The media frenzy was just beginning. He knew the truth had to be told, beyond these walls, to the public, to the world. It wasn't just about clearing his name anymore. This was about forcing the country to reckon with its systemic issues. But as they walked out of the courthouse, Marcus felt a sense of urgency. His phone buzzed in his pocket. It was a message from his media contact asking for a press conference. The story was breaking, and the public needed to hear from him. There was a growing momentum, and Marcus couldn't afford to let it slip away. The press conference was set for the following morning. Marcus stood in front of the microphones, the cameras flashing relentlessly. It was surreal. A few months ago, he had been just another man trying to navigate the challenges of life as a black man in America, trying to live his truth while constantly fighting against biases. Now he was standing before the world, the face of a movement that was larger than just one person. The stakes had never felt higher. He cleared his throat, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I stand here today, not as a victim, but as someone who has fought for justice and will continue to do so. What happened to me was not an isolated incident. Officer Blake's actions, Captain Daniels' failure to intervene, and the systemic issues within their department are just one example of the larger problem we face in this country. A problem that has plagued our communities for generations." His words were met with silence, and Marcus could see the weight of his statement settle on the reporters before him. The press conference would be broadcast across the nation. The truth, the real truth, was finally out there. "We can't ignore this any longer," Marcus continued. "Racial profiling, discrimination, and the abuse of power are not isolated issues. They are systemic problems that are affecting lives every single day. It is time for change, and it starts now. We must hold people accountable, and we must demand transparency and reform at every level of our justice system." The audience's reaction was immediate, with cameras rolling and reporters scribbling down notes. But as Marcus looked around, he knew that the battle wasn't over. It had only just begun. The media would dissect every word, the backlash would come, but it didn't matter. His truth had been spoken. In the days that followed, the fallout from the press conference was swift. News outlets across the country covered the story, with some outlets supporting Marcus' stance while others tried to discredit him, claiming he was playing the race card. There were protests in the streets, petitions demanding police reform, and calls for broader systemic change. But there were also voices of resistance, those who didn't want to believe that there was a problem at all. People who couldn't fathom that their precious institutions were capable of such injustice. But Marcus knew that the truth was undeniable, and there was no turning back now. His team worked tirelessly behind the scenes to coordinate with civil rights organizations, activists, and legal teams. The Department of Justice launched an investigation into Blake and Captain Daniels, and soon, the entire police department was under review. The conversation about police reform had reached a tipping point, and Marcus had sparked it. Months passed, and Marcus found himself at the center of a movement. He had become the face of change, the symbol of resilience in the fight for justice. But as he stood in front of a crowd of thousands, speaking at a rally for police reform, he couldn't shake the feeling that the work was far from done. The victory of exposing the corruption of Officer Blake was significant, but the real work, the hard work, had just begun. Marcus had learned so much throughout this journey. He had learned the true cost of silence, the power of speaking truth to power, and the strength that came from standing up when everything seemed stacked against you. But more than anything, he had learned that change was possible. It might take years, it might take generations, but every step toward justice was a victory. As he spoke to the crowd, his voice strong and resolute, he thought of the future. There was still so much to do, so much to fix. But with the support of his allies and the power of the truth on his side, Marcus knew that anything was possible. And as the rally concluded, with cheers and applause echoing in his ears, he knew that this was just the beginning of the fight. The road ahead was long, but he was ready, because for the first time in his life, he truly felt like he was part of something bigger, something that could and would change the world. The journey was far from over, but Marcus was no longer the same man he was when this all began. The scars of injustice, the pain of racial profiling, had been transformed into something stronger: determination. He wasn't just fighting for his own future anymore. He was fighting for the future of everyone who had been overlooked, misjudged, and silenced. And with each step forward, he knew that his struggle, his fight for justice, would make a difference. It was a difference worth fighting for. The days following the press conference were a whirlwind. Marcus's name, once just a figure in a quiet suburban neighborhood, had now spread across headlines. His voice, steady and determined, had ignited a conversation that reached beyond his personal experience, touching the hearts of people across the nation. What began as a fight for justice on behalf of one black man had become a fight for a systemic change that was long overdue. As Marcus stood by the window of his apartment, watching the city lights flicker in the distance, he reflected on how far he had come. He had always known the system was flawed, that people like him were often overlooked, judged, and wronged. He had spent years working tirelessly, proving himself, rising above obstacles that many others couldn't even begin to understand. But it wasn't until the events of the last few weeks that he truly realized the depth of the injustice that existed. The system was broken, and the truth had to be told. It wasn't just about him. It was about the countless others who had been silenced, ignored, and unjustly treated. Looking back, Marcus could hardly recognize the man who had walked into that courthouse months ago. He was no longer the same. The man who had been wronged by Officer Blake, and the system had become a symbol of resilience and the power of speaking out. He had learned that it wasn't enough to wait for change. Sometimes you had to fight for it. It was this realization that had guided him through every step of this journey. When Blake had detained him for no reason, when the world had seemed determined to silence him, Marcus had felt a surge of anger and frustration. He had wanted to scream, to lash out, to take matters into his own hands. But instead, he had stayed calm. He had relied on his training, his intellect, his understanding of the law, and most importantly, his belief in justice. And in doing so, he had turned a moment of personal humiliation into a platform for change. The arrest was never just about the wrongful detainment of a man. It was about an entire system that had been operating under the belief that people like Marcus, people of color, were suspects before they were citizens. His story had struck a chord with so many because it wasn't just his fight. It was a fight that so many had been enduring quietly for far too long. The momentum of his public stand was undeniable. Over the following weeks, Marcus watched as change started to unfold. The media coverage had sparked a national conversation about police reform, systemic racism, and accountability. The actions of Officer Blake and the department's attempt to cover up their misconduct were just the tip of the iceberg. Investigations began not just into the actions of the officers involved, but into the broader issue of racial profiling within the police force. Marcus's case had triggered a wave of reform that spread across the country. Police departments started reviewing their practices, launching investigations into their training programs, and working to address systemic biases. Local lawmakers pushed forward legislation aimed at ensuring transparency in law enforcement and demanding more oversight in police departments. Marcus was no longer just a man fighting for his own dignity. He had become the voice for all those who had faced the same prejudices, the same racial profiling, and the same unjust treatment. And the country was listening. But even as the momentum grew, Marcus knew the work was far from done. It would take time, decades perhaps, to truly heal the wounds of the past and dismantle the system that had allowed these abuses to go unchecked for so long. Change, he had learned, was never easy, and it never came without resistance. But it was possible, and he was determined to continue the fight. As he prepared for another round of meetings with activists, lawmakers, and civil rights organizations, he couldn't help but feel a sense of responsibility weighed down on him. He had become a symbol of progress, but that progress came with a price. His personal life had been turned upside down. His relationships had been tested, and the backlash from those who wanted to maintain the status quo was relentless. But for every threat and every insult, there were 1,000 messages of support. There were people who were ready to stand alongside him, who were willing to take the risks, just as he had. The battle was not over, not by a long shot. But Marcus had come to understand that it was the small victories, the ones that didn't always make the headlines, that were just as important. The moments when he spoke to a group of young people, encouraging them to stand up for what was right, or when he had a quiet conversation with a fellow activist about what needed to change next. It was those moments that built the foundation for a future that he hoped would be different. As the weeks turned into months, Marcus began to settle into a new role. His days were filled with meetings, interviews, and strategy sessions, but he made time for those quieter moments too. He made time to listen, to mentor, to remind others that this fight wasn't just about one person, one officer, or one department. It was about all of them. The progress that had been made was just the beginning. The real work was in the conversations, in the relationships being built, and in the hearts and minds that were slowly beginning to shift. The world was different now, and so was Marcus. He had become the kind of person who wasn't afraid to speak out, who wasn't afraid to face the consequences of his actions, no matter how high the stakes. His journey had taken him from a place of fear and frustration to one of strength and resolve. He had learned that the truth, no matter how painful, was always worth fighting for. And in that fight, there was strength to stand tall in the face of adversity, strength to challenge the system that had tried to tear him down, and strength to keep moving forward, even when the road ahead seemed impossible. As he walked out of his office one evening, the city skyline stretching before him, Marcus couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. The battle was far from over, but he had already won so much. He had taken on the system, and while the outcome wasn't perfect, it was a victory nonetheless. The world had changed because of his actions, and he had changed too. But most importantly, he had sparked a movement that would continue long after he was gone. The truth, once hidden, was now out in the open, and nothing would ever be the same again. And Marcus, standing tall and resolute, knew that this was only the beginning. The fight for justice wasn't over, but the world was finally waking up, and Marcus would be there to ensure that the fight for equality, for justice, and for a better future would never stop. As he walked into the night, his heart light despite the weight of the journey that still lay ahead, Marcus knew one thing above all: the change they had fought for, the change he had fought for, was possible. And as long as there were people willing to stand up, to speak the truth, and to demand justice, progress would continue, step by step, until every person could walk through the world without fear, without bias, and without the weight of an unjust system holding them back. The fight would never be easy, but it was a fight worth having. And with every step forward, they were one step closer to a world where justice truly did belong to everyone.